Was kind enough to bring the key, or he forgot to bring the key and forgot to lock it. But
No,
there is beer. There is beer if anybody's interested. And so, thanks for coming. This is kind of a spur of the moment seminar, but Peter Hamilton called and said he's going to be in town, and why not take a good opportunity to hear about Gulf of Mexico. So Peter's had an interesting career. He got his PhD in Liverpool in 1973. And instead of beating himself up at a university for his entire career, he decided to beat himself up at a private concern. But basically doing the same kind of research that we do. And in his case, largely in the Gulf of Mexico, but much more varied than that. Peter's been living and working in Raleigh, North Carolina now for, well, we overlap when I was still at NC State, and he's now retired and I guess has an office at NC State if he wants to use it. And we're going to hear about some new results from observations in the deep Gulf of Mexico. And so in essence, how does the loop current work? And what do we know about those workings? And I guess what do we not know about those workings? So, Peter, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give a very broad overview of circulation processes in the Gulf of Mexico that we've observed from two big BOEM studies, one of which is just completed, the other was completed a couple of years ago. The first thing to do is to acknowledge my principal investigators and collaborators for all this work, and include Amy Bauer and Heather Fury at Woods Hole, Kathy Donahue and Randy Watts at URI, Bob Laban at CCAR, and Paula and Julio Scheinbaum at CICESE in Mexico. And this is basically what I want to cover. They're divided into two basins, the loop current and the eastern basin, and the western basin and the boundary currents. The loop current, we want to be looking at large meanders of the eastern loop current front and baroclinic instability. We are seeing anticyclones being generated under an advancing loop current, and we're seeing topographic Rossby waves radiating from the loop current. And the observations are generally from full depth moorings with pies, and also a few from deep Rayfrost floats. In the western basin, we're almost entirely looking at Rayfrost floats deep at 15 and 2,500 meters. We're looking at loop current interactions of the deep water with loop current eddies. Deep cyclonic boundary currents we find hugs the escarpments around most of the basin. We have a cyclonic gyre in the deepest part of the western basin, which I'll talk about later. We see also a lack of exchange between the eastern and western basins. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but the loop current, in this case, this is from the SSH and the sea surface temperature. The loop current is shown from port to port mode from the Yucatan to the Straits of Florida. It has just shed an eddy, a loop current anticyclone. This one is called Eddy Icarus. And 6 months earlier than that, it shed a previous eddy called Hadal, and this is that in the western basin, which is split into two due to its interactions with these cyclonic flows and also the topography of the western slope. So that's a split eddy Hadal. And in the Campeche Bay, we see a cold cyclone, and you can see it in the temperature record as well. And that this is not an eddy as all the rest of them are. It's driven by the wind stress curl across the Bay of Campeche. So it's a wind-driven gyre rather than an eddy. One of the most important features of deep flows, and by this I mean stations that are in 2,000 meters or more, is the actually the simplicity of the statistics of the flows. These are the fluctuation flows, so we've taken the means out, and we're looking at, do you have a pointer? Okay. Oh, I can do it on here. I can do it on here as well. If we look at A3, which is under the loop current, that's the red and the blue, we can see you have a surface intensified mode that has quite a large amplitude, and it decreases to 0 at around 1200 meters or a little less. And then we have a almost depth independent mode. There is some twist to the surface, but that's probably noise, that it goes up all through up to 1000 meters at least, and probably up to the surface. And then when we go to L4, we see the same pattern. We have a surface intensified mode that's a bit shallower, goes to 0 below about 900 meters. And then you have what we call a bottom intensified mode, which is starts off largish at the bottom and then decreases as you go up, particularly above about 1500 meters. So these bottom intensified modes we've sometimes identified as due to topographic Rossby waves. So we can represent the structure through these complex EOF modes to about 95% of the low frequency variance at both places. So that when you measure bottom currents in the deep eastern basin, you're actually looking at a component of the flow that goes all the way up to the surface. So if we look at, from those modes, if we look at the kinetic energy, and in this case I've divided it up into 3 parts. The yellow is the mean kinetic energy due to the mean flow. And then the red is the surface intensified mode, which is the one I showed in the previous picture. And the blue is the barotropic mode, or quasi-barotropic mode. And you can see that as you run along the Campeche slope on the west side of the loop current, you're seeing approximately equal division between mean flow and fluctuating flows over the slope. But as soon as you get into deep water, as soon as you get off the edge of the slope, you begin to see the mean flow diminish, and actually the fluctuating flows diminish somewhat, and the depth independent mode, or nearly depth independent mode, becoming dominant in the energy, in the kinetic energy balance. So as you go around the loop current, you see this getting more important as you go around, and the mean flow becoming less, relatively less. So the question is, what is going on there in the deep water to transfer energy down to the bottom? Because when you have a barotropic mode, you're seeing flows going all the way through the water column. So this is a hand animation of loop current, the loop current shedding Eddy Hadal in 2011. And the pictures are every 15 days, and what you'll see is the heavy line is the current date, and the fainter line is the previous date, 15 days previously. And the red currents are 5-day averages at 100 meters approximately. So find this thing. Right. So what you can see is that on the east side of the thing, you get these large deflections of the front. You don't get very large deflections of fronts on the west side, but on the east side you get these large deflections of fronts that look like meanders. We have a crest here and a trough here, and as we advance, you can see that the crest and trough propagate down towards the southeast and the Straits of Florida. And similarly there, you can see the later one is always, the trough is always further south than the previous one, and you can similarly see the thing. In this particular eddy, those fluctuations decreased, and the loop current straightened out and it advanced a bit further into the Gulf. And then it started again, generating these big meanders, about 300 kilometer wavelength, periodicity is 40 to 60 days. So we keep going, and then it sort of straightened out again and stretched out a bit further, and then eventually we see it separate. The trough gets big enough in this region that it causes separation or detachment of the eddy from the loop current itself. The contour is the 17 centimeter SSH contour, which is approximately the maximum region of maximum speed of the current. So and then you can see it separate. Now, one thing that's often come up in these types of things is that it appears to be a cyclonic flow in this region here, but lots of people have thought that it came up through the loop current and spontaneously exploded. But the evidence from the observations is actually the cyclonic flow in the trough here was actually squeezed through the neck into this region against the Campeche bank. So the cyclonic flow that develops in this region here on the other side of the neck actually originated from the east side of the current. And what I'm plotting here is the depth of the 6-degree isoscale, which is essentially the bottom of the loop current. So it's where it's shallow is the cyclonic, and where it's deep it's showing the anticyclonic clockwise circulation. So very basic baroclinic instability. If you have a meandering jet, which is what we're saying the loop current, east side of the loop current is over deep water, then if baroclinic instability occurs, then you generate a low frequency deep eddy underneath it, and a cyclonic eddy underneath the trough, and an anticyclonic eddy underneath the crest. The major feature is that they're displaced from the trough downstream. So these eddies are displaced by approximately 90 degrees downstream. And when you have those situations, you get both growth in intensity of these bottom eddies and also the strength of the meanders. So this is traditional baroclinic instability theory, such as you see for the jet stream and the Gulf Stream, etc. So the next stage is we looked, we had an array of instruments out. Well, let me just go back a minute. The array of instruments you can see on this map. The dark blocks are full depth moorings. The smaller ones are bottom moorings, and the little dots, little diamonds, are pies, which measure the sound echo, inverse echo sounders, which measure bottom pressure and the sound travel from this bottom to the surface and back, which gives you temperature structure. So that's the array, which I'm not going to say much about. And this is mainly Cathy Donohue's work, and but on these maps we basically took the signals from this array and bandpassed them between 40 and 100 days, because that's where most of the energy is. And the solid contours that are filled are the surface SSH that's been filtered by this bandpass, and the open contours are the bottom flows also filtered 40 to 100 days. The green line is the loop current front from the 17 centimeter contour, And you can see fairly clearly that you have a surface anticyclone here, and you have a bottom anticyclone which is displaced southwards of the crest. And similarly, here you have a surface cyclone in the crest, in the trough of this loop current, and then the bottom one is displaced southwards is a bottom cyclone. So you can track these things fairly well round. So you can see that C and B start to move round and across the loop current. So you can see C is there now. It gets down to here, and you can see that these things don't follow the surface flow, because the surface flow has to go out through the Straits of Florida. Straits of Florida is only 800 meters deep, and the bottom flows are in 2,000 to 3,000 meters. So they have to go somewhere, and they tend to go across and out towards the northwest. Okay. So if we look at eddy detachments and eddy bottom kinetic energy, so what I'm plotting here is the area of the loop current plus the area of the eddy. So this is the area of the loop current between here and here, and the area of the eddy. So when they run together, they're attached, and when they separate, they're detached. And you can see that actual separation for these eddies consists of often several detachments and reattachments before they actually escape into the Western Gulf. So we have Eddy Ekman, Eddy Franklin, which is the time period when the oil spill occurred, and Eddy Hadal and Eddy Icarus, which we got the first detachment. So as you can see, you've got these sawtooth things. They grow, the loop current grows, and then you get a detachment, and then it regrows again, and you get another detachment or separation. So if you look at the bottom currents, which is taking this array here and looking at the eddy kinetic energy in 3 bands. The red line is the low frequency subtidal band, 40R low pass if you like, or averaged on all the bottom current meters. You calculate the eddy kinetic energy, bottom coverage, and then average them all. And then the second one is the 20-day and above periods, and then the solid line is the 40-day and above periods. So you get, while you get these detachment periods, and sometimes during the end of the growth period, you get these huge increases in eddy kinetic energy in this region, and most of it, or a large portion of it, is in these 40 to 100-day fluctuations. The difference in timing is due to the position of the ray relative to the eddy separations. So in Hadal, it's separated in the middle of the array, so you tend to get the high energy just before it separates. So we're attributing these high exchange increases in bottom eddy kinetic energy due to baroclinic instabilities, just as we saw from the previous mappings. And you can see the depth of the 6-degree isotherm shows you when it's cold between eddies, and then it warms up and gets cold, warms up, etc. Okay, so now I'm going to change data sources to the Lagrangian study. This is another BOEM study which has just been completed, as far as the final report has just been submitted in January. And here we deployed Rayphos floats at 1500 decibars and 2500 decibars. All the 2500 decibars were deployed in the Eastern Gulf. The 1500 was spread throughout the whole Gulf. And you can see we had 122 1500 ones and 37 2500 decibars. We also had 6 profiling floats that were equipped with Rayphos units, so you could track them when they were deep. And we ended up with 194 float years of location velocity data, and 66 of these floats had mission lengths of 630 days, or just over 18 months. and the maximum number of floats per month was around 62. So we have and the whole 4-year period is covered, not intensely, but fairly well. So this is one of our best periods of coverage, and you can see we have, we have loop current, which has just shed this big eddy here we call Kraken, and is in a fairly retreated position. You see lots of activity in this region. The blue ones are at 1,500 meters, the red ones at 2,500 meters, and the purple ones are the apex floats also at 1,500 meters. So this is a sort of typical kind of coverage we got on a monthly basis. Each one of those tracks is 30 days. And the black dot represents the end of the track. So if you look in the Eastern Gulf, you see we had between 50 and 60 over a nearly 2-year period operating at the same time. We had some problems in the startup of the experiment with the instrument failures, but once we got going, we were doing quite well. Okay, so what I show, this is a bit busy, but these are maps every 15 days again, and each trajectory at 1,500 and 2,500 meters is 16 days long, so slight overlap. And what we're interested in is in the anticyclones and cyclones under the loop current that generate. And you can clearly see that as this eddy front develops a big meander, you can see this cyclonic flow directly on the trailing or the leading edge of the trough here. And if you look carefully, you can see an anticyclone on the leading edge of this crest as well, just before Kraken separates. Kraken reattaches before it actually goes away. So if we look at this period, these 3 plots in a little more detail, you can see that this cyclone is quite vigorous here, and you can see it generating from here, and then it gets more intense, and then it's again fairly intense here. So we want to look at that a little more carefully, and this is a series of maps. These are 10 days apart, the 10-day trajectories, and you can see the floats coming. This is the front. This is the loop current front, 17 centimeter contour again, and the sea surface height. And you can see it come in and start to wrap round, and it tightens up. Again, all cyclonic on the edge until the eddy separates, and then the floats tend to want to wander off towards the west. The floats record temperature at the constant depth, and you can track these floats quite well by the temperature. So when they go under the warm part, temperature warms up. When they go into the cold part of the overlying water, the temperature goes down. So we can actually see the upper water mass quite well from the small changes in temperature on the floats. So we want to look at loop current cyclones and velocities, so we constructed a standard deviation ellipse on the velocities and then divided it up into little annular areas and calculated the mean velocities in each of the segments. And this is what you end up with. The black arrows are the circulation. You can see it's strongly cyclonic. It has speeds of up to about 20 centimeters per second. Again, you've got to remember that these flows probably go all the way up through the surface, except you can't see them because of the higher speeds of the loop current itself. So you can see that these flows will be interacting with the crest, the trough of the jet. So we get about a quarter a Rossby number of about 1/4 in the center, and then it decreases as you go out. And there's indication that it's not really in solid body rotation, which, where you have a linear gradient in velocity from the middle to the outside. It looks like you get a little bit of a gradient in the middle, and then it is almost even across most of the cyclone. So we can. This is a trajectory from one of the 1,500 meter floats, and this has been kinematically analyzed into ellipses and paths, so that we get an ellipse. These are actually cyclones as well. So the cyclone is you get the center of it as a trajectory, and it comes in, goes out, crosses the loop current, and then goes out, and then we lose the cyclonic circulation. The loop current, you can see, is crossing the neck of the loop current as it does that. So we have some good indication, and also from other data, is that these cyclones cross the loop current and then would go off into the Western Gulf, except we don't see them in the Western Gulf, as we'll see. So I'll go back to my map again for the detachment of Kraken, and this time we'll look at this period, these 3 plots, and here you can see we're developing an anticyclone under an advancing loop current. So as the loop current advances, we seem to generate an anticyclone until these things start to move off. So again, let's look at that in a little more detail. You can see the anticyclone or clockwise circulation here. These are all 2,500 meters, and then it actually intensifies over here. So we did the same kind of analysis. So this is the loop current front, and you can see an anticyclonic circulation here. And again, the temperature shows you when you're going. In this case, the dot is the beginning of the trajectory. And as the loop current advances, you can see the warm water generated at 1,500 meters and there. So you can see this first month shows the anticyclone, and then in the second month you get a more intense version of it as the loop current front has advanced into the Gulf. We think you can explain these primarily as a lower layer conservation of potential vorticity, a result of conservation of potential vorticity, where H is the lower layer depth below the loop current. So as the loop current advances, that depth gets squeezed, and consequently you get more negative relative vorticity, and you generate an anticyclone. That's what seems to be happening there. That seems to be a little bit different from the baroclinic instability eddies. Okay, so we look at the velocities, and again you can see we have quite high speeds, particularly in the second part where it intensifies. We're getting again up to 15 to 20 centimeters per second in the rotation. And again, we'll go back to that. So during this period after the developer crack, you see quite a lot of energy going on, particularly in this period while the eddy is detached, but you can see the baroclinic instability process is still active along the northern deep water part of the front along the eddy. And you can see these fairly intense cyclones and anticyclones. But after the eddy departs, we start to see a decrease in energy particularly in the northwest part of the Gulf. So northeast part of the Gulf. So you see very small fluctuations in this region until the loop current starts to advance again. And what we find is that we get these big, long, linear fluctuations here that we're attributing to topographic Rossby waves, which I'll show in a little more detail in a minute. So the loop current very nicely behaved. It went south and stayed south for quite a long time to show you the decay of the fluctuations in the northeast. So we divided the area into 3 boxes, one under the loop current, one to the northeast, they're all the same size, and one to the west, slightly overlapping. And we divided into 16-day intervals and looked at the eddy kinetic energy in those 16 days interval and the mean kinetic energy in those 16-day intervals, and then moved the window on a daily basis to generate a time series. So the time series I'll show next are the averages for each of these boxes. So this is what we see. So again, this is the separation of Kraken and the generation of Lazarus. And what you see after Kraken is you see this high energy, eddy kinetic energy, exactly as we saw before under the loop current, less so to the northeast and less so to the west. But once you get past this hump, you see this steady decay in all three regions of the eddy kinetic energy. But if we look at the mean flows in the westernmost box, we get this strong westward flow occurring not long after the eddy has departed from the region. So you get this strong westward flow here, reflected in this mean kinetic energy, and also this peak of the eddy kinetic energy, which occurs later than the ones under and to the northeast. So there's indication that the energy is decaying and being transmitted towards the west. And we think this is done by topographic Rossby waves because we don't see very many eddies in this region. This is 3 floats that tracked almost all together over a period of 5 months and did not move to the west. So there was no mean flow associated with these fluctuations. And they obey the topographic Rossby wave type of things in that there is a slight angle to the isobath, mean isobaths, and appear to be propagating towards the 6B escarpment. So if we look at 10-day sequences of these, again the dot is at the end of the sequence. So you can see these are all 2,500 meters and they all track together for quite long periods. They reverse, come back, head backwards, and then start to change the angle at which they're crossing the isobaths. Again, this is in topographic Rossby waves, the longer period, faster moving waves are closer to the isobaths than the shorter period, slower moving waves, which is what we seem to be seeing here. So if we look at the TRW velocities for those 3 floats, you can see that the record is highly coherent because they're all tracking together. And you get a nice peak around 30 days or so, which is a typical period where we see most energy. But the fluctuations are quite broad and look very similar to what we see in current meter records from near the 6B escarpment. All right, Western Basin. So we have this energy coming in from the loop current, and we think it gets rectified into a current. And you can see in this plot, we consider the black arrows to be 95% significance over the 4 years, 4-year mean period. The red arrows are not significant. But we can see there's a trace of a boundary current along the 6B escarpment, up along the Perdido escarpment, sort of fades away around 23 degrees north, though it's still there to some extent. Goes round the Bay of Campeche, and then along the Campeche Bank slope escarpment. And then some of it goes into the eastern basin and joins a gyre over here and another gyre over here. Notice it does not, you see it somewhat going up the West Florida escarpment, but then it disappears in the DeSoto Canyon region. So the main features of here are this clockwise, anti-clockwise boundary current, cyclonic boundary current. And we also have this cyclonic gyre in the deepest part of the Gulf, which was a new feature for the observationalists anyway. So you get this cyclonic gyre which only connects with the boundary current at this corner. So this seems to be a separate feature generally from the boundary current, the narrow boundary current you see hugging the escarpments. Get that one? Oh yeah, so that's why I give these. And the cyclonic gyre, and then we have a dipole under the loop current. So if you look at that more carefully, this is the variance ellipses and mean flows from the from the averaging period over a 2-year period this time, and we see flows coming around the Campeche escarpment, going around the bottom of the basin, and then joining these two gyres. So we have a cyclonic gyre on this side and an anticyclonic gyre on this side in the mean flows. And we also saw that in the observations from the current meters, bottom current meters from 3 years earlier. So we also see a cyclonic flow here and an anticyclonic flow on that side. And again, the explanation for this is that the loop current likes to lean towards the northwest, so it tends to want to compress the bottom layer on this side and stretch the bottom layer on this side, giving you a cyclone-anticyclone pair. And it was very nice to see that it came both from the Lagrangian drifter floats, and also from the current meters. All right, move on a little bit. I want to look at the mean kinetic energy and the eddy kinetic energy in the western versus the eastern basins. This is all from float data. And you can see we have this very high kinetic energy in the eastern basin, which we're attributing largely to baroclinic instability and maybe some of the anticyclones generating under the tip. And you can see it stretches towards the 6B escarpment, and then it starts to fade away as you go to the west. We see a hot spot here, and some hot spots around here, around 23. When we look at the mean kinetic energy, we see rather relatively low mean kinetic energy in the eastern basin, but this gyre, this clockwise gyre, this cyclonic gyre, has a great deal of persistence, and so we have relatively high mean kinetic energy in that cyclonic gyre, which seems to be separate from the boundary current itself. When we look at, we did some automatic eddy detection from the trajectories of the floats, and the eddy criteria was the periods had to be greater than 2 inertial periods, and they have to stay in the eddy more than 3 rotations. And you can see out of only 45 out of 168 trajectories contain eddies, or approximately 10% of the total trajectory rate, or 2,620 float days. We found 26 anticyclones and 25 cyclones. Cyclones tend to be concentrated in the eastern Gulf, and again relevant to the baroclinic instability processes. But in the western Gulf, we see relatively few. There's some cyclonic activity here, and then there's quite a bit of anticyclonic activity here, but it does not appear to come from the eastern Gulf. It's actually generated from this slope. There are some boundary eddies along here and along here, but generally speaking, this high energy activity does not get into the eastern Gulf. Again, we're sort of consistent with topographic Rossby waves. So this is 2 float tracks. This is 2,500 meters. It makes a loop, gets into the boundary current. We lost some tracking here, but it continues all the way down around the Bay of Campeche until it got stuck here. This one is a 1,500 meter. Started here, went all the way around the boundary current of Campeche, and then at this point, at this corner, the boundary current detached, and it spun up into anticyclones, which translated westward. So we seem to have a boundary current instability here where it detaches from the slope and sometimes can generate these anticyclones. So we had more than one case where that occurred, maybe 5 or 6 cases where that kind of feature. So as far as we can tell, these kinds of activity have nothing to do with what's going on in the surface layer. They seem to be completely related to the boundary current and the bottom layer. I mean, this has not been fully tested yet, but we're trying. Amy has been trying to look very hard to see whether she can see any eddy activity in the surface layer that would trigger these boundary current eddies. All right, this is the last topic. Timeline of loop current eddy separations during the Lagrangian study. Here are 3 eddies that went across. They all went across more or less in the same region until they started to break up. In my diagrams, thick line is from separation to 90 degrees west, which is usually the measure of when it's fully free of the loop current. The dotted line is its translation across the western basin, and then the thin line is where it starts to interact with the western slope and begin to diminish in size and produce lots of secondary eddies. So Kraken was very nice, Icarus was very nice, Jumbo was a bit of a mess, Lazarus was a bit of a mess. So I've only got time to show you Icarus, which is this one. And this is Icarus. This is again the 17 centimeter SSH. And as it comes across the northern slope in a sort of westward or slightly southwest, west-southwest direction, you can see 2 floats come in. As they become under the influence of the eddy, they move southwards into deep water, and as the eddy moves back, they go back up into shallow water. And then similarly goes back and forth as the eddy departs. And the simple model for what's happening here is that if we look at that float, you can see the SSH across the eddy. You can see the float temperature as it goes across the eddy, so it warms up as it goes under the eddy. And you can see the bottom depth. So as it goes to bottom depth, it goes deeper, and as the eddy passes over, it starts to go shallower again. And what we think is happening here is that as the eddy comes over, the bottom water tries to conserve F over H, where H is the lower layer depth, and it just tries to move into deep water to conserve that F over H, and as the eddy moves over, it moves back. And the model for that is the deep western boundary current traversing under the Gulf Stream at Cape Hatteras. The deep western boundary current moves into deep water as it goes under the Gulf Stream, because the Gulf Stream is decreasing the lower layer depth. So that's this kind of interaction has not been observed before. Most models show that when an eddy translates across the Western Gulf, it generates trailing cyclones or leading anticyclones, and we see absolutely no evidence of that happens from the Gulf trajectories. Right. And then basin connectivity to indicate that we're not getting a lot of basin connectivity. So the floats launched east of 90 and ended up west 630 days later. Floats that were launched west of 90 degrees west and ended up east 630 days later are shown by the purple and blue arrows. And you can only see about less than 20% did that things. And then the black arrows are the ones that start in the east and stay in the east, and start in the west and stayed in the west. So it seems to indicate there's not a huge amount of connectivity between the deep waters of these two basins.
Are the blue and purple arrows correlated with the depth of the floats?
No, we're treating the 1,500 and 2,500 meters exactly the same.
Okay.
So Paula came up with this, she did a lot of connectivity analysis for these various regions of the Gulf. So if you have flows start in this area, where do they end up 630 days later, or 18 months later, 12 and 18 months later? And she came up with this conceptual model, the deep flows, or deep exchanges, I would say. So the ovals are retention areas, so we think that the northeast is an area where floats get retained, or water mass gets retained. Similarly, the Jaya region is also a region where floats get retained. And then you sort of get a generalized clockwise circulation with some indication of recirculation between I and C, and also I and A, or B and A, due to the boundary flows around this northern point. Okay, so that's a lot of topics. But so to summarize, so we think that the major mechanism that transfers large amounts of kinetic energy to the lower layer is baroclinic instability. We find that loop current tip anticyclones, or ones that occur under an advancing loop current, and the baroclinic instability eddies that move across the neck of the loop current dissolve and start radiating TRWs, double gravity Rossby waves, towards the 6B escarpment. The evidence is a bit sketchy, but that seems to be a reasonable explanation for what we're observing. The lower layer eddy kinetic energy tends to decay in the northeast when a loop current or a loop current eddy is not present, and there's theoretical reasons to say that rectification of TRWs may be forcing the western basin cyclonic boundary current, particularly along the northern slope, northern escarpments. There seems to be poor connectivity between basins, which is consistent with wave energy being radiated from the eastern basin to the western basin, rather than eddies being translated into the western basin. There's a cyclonic gyre over the deepest part of the western basin, which we don't have much idea of why that is there. And we have low numbers of eddies in the west, mainly anticyclones formed from the boundary current detachments along the Campeche escarpment, and loop current eddy transits interact through PV conservation, at least to first order, with the lower layer. Okay, so that's my very rapid survey of the deep Gulf of Mexico.